Good afternoon, everyone. We are now starting our session. I would like to confirm that you have no problem hearing before we get started. For those who would like to listen to this session in English, please click on the little globe at the bottom towards the right that says interpretation. Then you should click the language you wish to hear. I suggest that you make sure that at the bottom it says that the original audio is on mute. That way you won't be hearing two voices at the same time. That is to say, the voice of the interpreter and the voice of the speaker. All right, now, thank you very much for being with us here today and welcome to this session. I've lost track of how many we've done so far, but I do believe that this is the fourth session of this PAHO series of dialogues on research ethics during the pandemic, challenges and lessons to learn in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is a pleasure to be here with you once again at this fourth dialogue. I'm Carla Sainz, and I'm the Regional Advisor on Bioethics at PAHO. The PAHO Bioethics program is part of the Health Systems and Services Department. And on this occasion, we are going to have a dialogue with researchers who are conducting COVID-19 research. As we have said during our previous sessions of dialogue, the purpose of these sessions is to share the lessons that we have been learning over the course of the pandemic, not only with the view to improving our own response, but also to share knowledge that allows us to be better prepared to conduct research when a future health emergency may arise. It has been very enriching to hear the various perspectives, and we have been insisting from the outset that we didn't want to have just a theoretical webinar, a pre-planned webinar of presentations, but rather a more dynamic format in which we can brainstorm together about how to do things better. I think that we have had an excellent response in terms of expediting ethical research on COVID, which means making use of all of the ethical review processes. But I do still think that we have a lot to learn. Many of you will recall that one of the pillars of our approach to the ethics of research that is under the PAHO Regional Bioethics Program is to use research ethics systems to make sure that research is done ethically in our region. It does not suffice to have the work of the health authorities or to have ethics committees or to just cover researchers. We need to look at the entire system that also includes people who publish the research, those who fund research. And with this systemic overview, we can have a comprehensive approach to make sure that the research is in fact ethical. Researchers play a fundamental role in this system. For this reason, we felt that it was important to at least have a dialogue in which various researchers who are looking at COVID-19 in our region to come together. And we wanted to hear your thoughts on how we can spur ethical research in our region to improve the health and well-being of our populations. Before I introduce today's researchers, I did want to mention that I'm sorry that days are going by so quickly, but I think that since the last dialogue, I think last week, we published the PAHO guidance for ethical supervision of COVID research. In this, researchers play an essential role because they are the ones who need to be paying attention to the large volume of evidence that is being produced within the context of the pandemic and the way that their studies need to respond to that large volume of evidence to make sure that they are doing things as ethically as possible. In just a moment, I'm going to give you the link for the guidance for those who haven't been able to see it yet. And also, as we always do, I'm going to give you the link to our list of ethical research for those who are not yet registered, can register and receive the resources, invitations to future dialogues, new publications, and other tools to catalyze ethical research that we share through PAHO. So now it is a pleasure to have with us 4 researchers who happen to be from the 4 countries that, according to the study we conducted at PAHO on clinical trials in the region, are the 4 countries that produce more clinical trials or have been producing more clinical trials within the context of COVID-19, and that's Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia. Thank you very much for being here with us today. I know that you researchers are really busy at this time, but I will now go into the introductions. We have Silvina Kuperman with me from Argentina. I'm not going to go into the details of what your research is about. You can mention that yourself. We also have with us Juan Manuel Anaya from the immune diseases from the University of Rosario, Colombia. We also have Ricardo Palacios from the Pantan Institute of Brazil and Jose Gotes Palazuelos from the National Institute of Medical Science and Nutrition, Salvador Subirán in Mexico. Thank you very much for being with us today. And once again, we also have moderators with us. We have Ana Palmero and Sarah Caracero. Ana Palmero is at the Ministry of Health of Argentina, and Sarah's at the National Health Institute of Peru, and both of them are working as consultants with the Regional Bioethics Program of PAHO. And they have worked with me helping to put out all of the guidance documents on ethics within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. It feels like we've been working on this for a long time. So thank you very much for being here. And we will now start our session. Anna will ask, or rather will moderate the first part of the dialogue. And for the second part, led by Sarah, I would like you to ask any questions you'd like to ask of the researchers, any one of them or all of them. There might be some questions that only apply to one of them, but please specify that and we can add these up either in the chat or in the Q&A section of the session. We will then collect them and make sure that they are asked of the researchers during the second half of the dialogue. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Ana. Hello and good afternoon. Thank you very much, researchers, for being with us today. To kick things up, I'd like to ask you what your research has consisted of. That is to say, your research related to COVID. And so tell us very briefly what you've looked at. Who would like to start? Oh, Silvina? Thank you very much, Carla, for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here today. This is the first time that I've participated in these dialogues. In terms of the kind of research we're conducting, it is related or was related to establishing the effectiveness and safety of convalescent plasma in a given group of patients. This research project was done within the framework of the Ministry of Health of the National Ministry of Health of Argentina under the National Bureau of Blood. Why is it important? It's the first experience that we have carried out with the blood banks, the transfusion medical services, and the Intensive Therapy Society of Argentina and the laboratories, which at that time they were looking at the possibility of getting antibodies from the COVID positives and then the neutralizing antibodies, which required a complex structure within the laboratory to measure the neutralizing antibodies to see whether the dose that we were giving to the patients was going to be effective. And I mention this because none of the group of researchers comes from basic research. We all provide care and we have experience with epidemiological and clinical research, but nobody from basic science and no one with a lot of experience in requesting subsidies. In other words, we were investigating at the same time that we were learning, as is true of everyone, we were learning about the etiology and the evolution and what the virus was all about. But at the same time, we were learning how to work in the midst of a pandemic and not being at our home workspaces. So we were designing a study, or we designed a study that was rather modest, very small. It wasn't a randomized controlled clinical trial. It was a study of two groups assignment station in which this allowed us with a very small number as we were going through treating the patients to see whether we could continue this or not. So it was extremely preliminary. When we designed the study, the only two studies had been done, two papers that were, one was of 5 cases, another one of 10 cases that came from China. At that time, we did not even get antibodies from donors. So we're looking at the patients with the pool of plasma waiting to get the result, and only later were we able to establish the titer that was closest to what the patients needed. And I'm saying this because it was a trial on 27 patients and awaiting statistical consistency. 9 responded to the plasma, only 6 responded. When we talk about a response, we're saying that it went PCR turned negative, and on day 27, or rather patient 27, we did an interim analysis and we communicated with the sites where they were treating the patients, and we're letting them know. So take just one more minute to explain that that trial was marked by the guidelines that we put out from the Ministry of Health. In other words, they call me a collaborator or an advisor to regulate the transfusion of plasma. Doing this very small clinical trial that was an example for others. And we had a single registry of clinical trials to see what was happening in Argentina vis-a-vis whether or not this research should go forward. And we put out the guidelines for the selection of donors and some good manufacturing practices. As you know, at a blood bank, it's not like it's like a medicine factory. So we have to have tremendous consistency in the product that we were offering. And we prepared a protocol, an extended one, to see that other banks could add to them who were not part of the clinical trials. And we spoke against the use of passive that time. It was April 18th, and our first case had been about a month earlier in March. And we were reviewing the literature according to our own observations. Thank you very much, Silvina. Jose, would you like to speak next? Hello, and thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here with you, sharing our various viewpoints and experiences with this. I'm in Mexico City, and we are working on a protocol and a clinical phase 2 study. It's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, a multi-center study, and it's also collaborative. So we are testing 2 specific drugs compared with the respective placebo among outpatient people with moderate to light COVID. That is information that's available, or large amount of information available for people with COVID. So this is just in people who have not, we have a lot more information on people who've had serious cases, pneumonia, and required hospitalization. We're trying to look at cases of light or moderate cases of COVID to see what therapeutic options are out there that might reduce the risk of more serious outcomes requiring hospitalization, et cetera, and getting PCRs to turn negative. So this is a group of patients that obviously it's a larger percentage of people in terms of COVID patients. And there are also limited therapeutic options for asymptomatic people. So this is an area of opportunity.
And obviously, there are certain situations that have to do with trying to come up with a clinical trial in that context and in the current pandemic context. We can address different aspects, the challenges, advantages, disadvantages, etc. But anyways, we are trying to address in this population group all these therapeutic options. Thank you, Jose. Ricardo, could you tell us a little bit about your research studies? Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to the Pan American Health Organizations through Ana, Carla, and the rest of the bioethics groups for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of the experience that we've had in COVID studies. I am going to focus, even though I have others, I'm going to focus on one specific experience. And we have a sponsor of one of the largest COVID vaccines in the region at this time, which is the vaccine study that we are performing together with Sinovac. Sinovac offers an inactivated virus for COVID-19, and we have 16 research centers throughout Brazil. And right now, we have over 10,000 participants as part of this research. We have a sponsor for this study, and the sponsor is in charge of, developing the clinical information and coordinating the 16 research centers, interacting with regulatory agencies, and also with our Sinovac associates in China and other stakeholders throughout the world, such as multilateral organizations, COVAX, the Gates Foundation, etc. So that's the kind of work we're doing. This is a type of work where actually we do not have direct contact with the research participants, but rather we have the overall control of the research study and all the clinical developments. And this task, this work began about 4 months ago. It started on July 21st. first. So 4 months worth of research with a lot of things that hopefully I'll have more time to share with you to the extent that the questions point in that direction. Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo, and good afternoon, Juan Manuel. Would you like to share with us your experience with research?
Claro, por supuesto. Muchas gracias y
Of
muy
course.
complacido de
Thank
estar aquí con
you very
ustedes
much.
esta
It's a
tarde.
pleasure
Gracias
for me
también, por
to be
supuesto, a la
here with
OPS por
you.
esta
And thank you, of
invitación.
course, to PAHO for this invitation.
Nuestro trabajo desde el punto de vista del
Our work from
ensayo
the point of view
clínico
of
en pacientes con
clinical
COVID se refiere
trials in
también
COVID
al uso de plasma de
patients also
convaleciente.
focuses
Nosotros
on using
desarrollamos un
convalescent
proyecto que se
plasma. We
llamó
developed
Proyecto
a
PC
project that was called
COVID-19, que
PC
tuvo dos partes. La
COVID-19 that
primera
had
parte
two
fue
parts. The first one
un ensayo
was a
clínico
clinical,
abierto
an
que
open rather
consideramos
clinical
fue una prueba de
trial that
concepto en
was
10
kind of like
pacientes.
a
Queríamos
concept test on 10
comprobar que
patients.
todas las
We wanted to make
variables y
sure
todos
that all of the
los
variables
requerimientos para
and
llevar a
all of the
cabo la segunda parte se
requirements to
pudieran
perform the second part of the study
controlar
could be
adecuadamente. Participamos
appropriately controlled.
investigadores de
It
varios centros
involved researchers from
universitarios
several
de
university
Bogotá y de
centers in
Medellín,
Bogotá and Medellín,
principalmente la Universidad del Rosario, la Universidad
mainly
CES,
Universidad del
la
Rosario, Universidad
Universidad
Cedes,
FUCS,
Fuchs
el Instituto Distrital de
University,
Ciencia, Biotecnología e Innovación en
the
Salud y el Grupo
Biotechnology
de
Innovations in Health
Infectología de la
Institute
Clínica María
and
en
the
Bogotá.
Infectology
El estudio
Institute
se llevó a
at the
cabo y
Bogota
terminamos
clinic. The
con 8
study was
pacientes con una muy
performed
buena
and we ended
respuesta y
up
2
with 8
pacientes que
patients with very good
desafortunadamente
response and 2
fallecieron.
patients that
Fueron muy
unfortunately
ilustrativos para
passed.
nosotros y una vez
This
terminamos
was very descriptive
esa
for
primera
us,
parte,
and
perdón,
once we
iniciamos la
finished
segunda
that
parte
first
del
part, we
proyecto
started
que
the second
consistió
part of the
en adelantar un
project,
ensayo clínico
which had to
controlado,
do with doing a
aleatorizado,
controlled,
paralelo y simple
randomized
ciego.
clinical
Lo hicimos en 92
trial that
pacientes,
was single-blinded.
46 de
We did
cada
it
grupo, y
in
nuestro
46
objetivo era
patients of each
evaluar
group, and our
si el
objective
plasma de
was to assess
convaleciente
whether the
era superior
convalescent
a la terapia
plasma was
convencional.
higher than
Una de las
conventional
características de nuestro
therapy.
estudio fue
One of the characteristics of our
ofrecerlo a
study was
pacientes
that
con
we
enfermedad
offered it
severa muy
to
tempranamente
severe patients very
hospitalizados,
early
pero
on
no
in
a
their
pacientes en cuidados
hospitalization, but not
intensivos.
to
Y la
patients that
otra
were already in
particularidad del
intensive
estudio
care.
fue que desde el
The other
primer momento
characteristic of the
decidimos
study is that from
utilizar
the very beginning, we
títulos de
decided to use
anticuerpos
titrates from
totales IgG e
full
IgA lo más
IgG and
alto posible,
IgA
con la esperanza de
antibodies
tener
as
una
high as
buena
possible,
correlación con anticuerpos
so that
neutralizantes que
hopefully we will
pudimos
have a
demostrar
correlation with
posteriormente.
neutralizing
Y
antibodies,
así
which we were able to prove later on.
incluimos hace ya
And
un par de semanas
about
atrás la
a
totalidad de
couple
los
weeks ago,
pacientes. El
we
estudio
included that
terminará
in all of our
el 11 de
patients. The
diciembre con el
study
último
will
paciente, su
conclude on
seguimiento a
December
28 días.
11th
Esperamos
with
tener
the final
resultados
follow-up, a
a
28-day
finales del
follow-up on
año
the
o a
patient, and
principios del
hopefully we will
2021.
have everything, all the results back at the beginning of 2021. Thank you very much, Juan Manuel. And from what I can see, you have a very different experiences. We have very small clinical trials and some others that are very large, such as the one Ricardo described. The second question has to do with what kind of challenges you faced. If you had to design the studies, what kind of challenges did you face, especially because you were in the middle of a pandemic with all the uncertainty we'd had at the very beginning? Maybe now we have a little bit more information, although not that much. And also, in terms of caring for the participants and all these new issues that kept coming up. So basically, what kind of challenges did you face in designing and carrying out your studies? Silvina, would you like to start? The main challenge was to be able to develop a multidisciplinary group. Those of us that work in blood banks are not very used to working on large clinical trials. So it was a learning experience from the design to, informed consent, the statistical design of our study, and also the challenging of going through all of the ethics research or centers. So in addition to this being an ethical requirement, it was very rich for the investigation purposes. That is to say, all the feedback that we got from the bioethics committees. As far as plasma, we had a very unique experience because we had a lot of pressure to use plasma outside of a clinical trial context, because in this context, when there was this little beacon of hope, both patients, family members, as well as the doctors, therapists, clinicians, hematologists, etc., put a lot of pressure to use plasma, even if we didn't have compelling evidence. So we're still missing some publications, but we can tell that we need antibody titrates that are much higher than what we had, and it doesn't benefit all patients equally. So the challenge was to be able to inform people based on available information. That was one of the biggest challenges that we had, because we need to make patients feel that they were not part of a clinical trial, that they were not poorly treated if they did not receive plasma. And that's what was one of the biggest issues we had. Thank you, Silvina. And Juan Manuel, since you also did a study with plasma, in your opinion, what were the main challenges and what kind of common ground can you have with Silvina? And when did your study begin also?
Nuestro estudio,
Well, our
el estudio
study,
piloto
the pilot
comenzó
phase,
los primeros días de junio
began in
y
early
terminamos
June,
en julio.
and we
Y el
finished in July.
estudio controlado aleatorizado
And the
comenzó el
randomized
8 de
controlized trial
agosto
started
y lo
on
vamos a
August
terminar con
8th,
el seguimiento
and
al
we
último
will
día, el día 28,
finish
el 11
after
de
the
diciembre.
28 follow-up period will be
Para hacer un
December
cálculo
11th.
más o menos del ingreso, ingresamos
So
aproximadamente
roughly
un
we
paciente por día.
admitted about a
Hubo
patient
semanas que
a
ingresamos
day.
más, semanas que
Some
ingresamos
weeks
menos.
we had
En
more,
estos
and some weeks
estudios
we had
existen las
less.
pérdidas, que
But
son
in
los
these
pacientes que desafortunadamente
trials,
tuvimos
we
que
have
trasladar de
losses, which
hospital,
are the
o los
patients that
pacientes
had to
que
be
se
transferred to another
retiraron del
hospital,
estudio. Tuvimos
or the
9
patients that we
pérdidas en
drew
total,
from the
o
study.
sea que
We had
ingresamos
9
101
losses total,
pacientes
so we
y
admitted
92 pacientes que
101 patient,
pudieron
and
ingresarse
but
completamente y con
only
seguimiento
we were only
completo.
able to finish
Yo
the
comparto
trial
las
on
mismas
92
inquietudes que ha
patients. And I share the
comentado
same
Silvia, por
concerns that
supuesto.
Silvina
Se generó una
mentioned.
expectativa muy
Of course,
grande,
there was a
teníamos
lot of
muchas solicitudes
expectation. We
para
had
hacer
a lot of
tratamientos
requests
compasivos. Nosotros
for
tuvimos la
compassive
autorización para hacer algunos
treatment,
tratamientos compasivos, pero
and
luego desistimos porque
we had some passive
el
treatment,
manejo de los
but
pacientes
then
con COVID
we
es
realized that managing a
bien
COVID
particular y
patient
no tuvimos la confianza para
was pretty
ofrecer
unique,
un plasma que no
and we
sabíamos cómo
could
se
not
estaba
offer
aplicando, cómo
a
era el
plasma that we did
tratamiento
not know how it was going
adicional
to
que se
be
le estaba
applied,
dando a los
and what
pacientes
kind
en
of
la medida en
additional
que los
treatment
compasivos que hicimos
was
fueron para
given
pacientes
to
críticos, que
be given to
comparto la
patients. So
opinión
we
de
did a passive treatment with
Silvina,
critical
por
patients. I
supuesto, no
agree with
creemos que sea
Silvina.
la
Of course,
indicación
we
y de
don't
hecho nuestro
believe
protocolo
that that
fue
was ideal.
diseñado para
And our
pacientes
protocol
severos,
actually was
tempranamente
developed for
hospitalizados, pero
severe
no para
patients
pacientes
in the
críticos.
early
Quizás la
hospitalization
mayor,
stage, but not for
el reto
critical
más grande que
patients.
tuvimos fue
The biggest
que
challenge we had
3 instituciones
was that
se pusieran de acuerdo para
to have
cumplir
3
un
institutions
protocolo
agree
muy
on
riguroso que
following a
establecimos.
very
Estuvimos muy bien
rigorous protocol
acompañados
that
por el
we
INVIMA,
developed,
que
where
es
we had
nuestra
a lot
entidad
of support
sanitaria
by
en el
INVIMA,
país
which is
y
our
que
health
nos
authority in
acompañó
our country,
durante
and
la
it
mayor parte del
supported
tiempo de
us
una
the
manera
majority
muy,
of the
muy
time. They were
permanente.
highly supportive.
Ese fue, yo creo, el principal reto,
So
pero
that was,
creo que
like I said, the
lo
main
cumplimos.
challenge, but I believe that we lived up to it. My apologies. Juan Manuel, we're having issues with interpretation when you speak. So can you please go to the globe that says interpretation and click on it and select mute original audio, please? That needs to
Sí,
be
está apagado.
muted. Yes, it is muted. And also to also, you have to click on an language and mute original audio, because we're hearing both your presentation and the interpretation at the same time. Is that better? Is that better?
Sí, creo que
I think we got it. I can't hear you now. Juan Manuel, can you hear me? Says Ana. Juan Manuel, can you hear Ana? I can't hear anyone right now. I can't hear you, says Juan Manuel. He can't hear us. Okay, all of a sudden I can hear you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Okay, Juan Manuel, you're going to get a message on the chat to see if we can resolve this technical issue. I can't hear you, says Juan Manuel. I can't hear you, Ana. So we'll work it out on the chat so that Ana can move on to the other panelists. Okay, in the meantime, we're going to move to Jose. The question had to do with the kind of challenges that you faced in developing and carrying out your studies in this highly complex context and so much uncertainty because we didn't have enough evidence, and even to this day we don't have enough evidence, and in terms of caring for the participants as well as the research team in general. Yes. In terms of challenges, well, doing research in this context is marred with challenges. As far as the design goes, I believe that one of the most relevant aspects is to have developments that are useful, that are based on hard data. But these developments keep changing as the pandemic evolves. So basically you have to constantly go over and reassessing all these developments to see if things are working. And in the sense of ambulatory patients, that's one of the most important aspects. That is to say, we cannot treat ambulatory patients at the beginning of the pandemic versus now, because obviously the scenario changes. So the biggest challenge is the ongoing changes. We need to change our design, we need to amend our protocols, amend our follow-up procedures, and we need to come up with hard data in terms of scientific outcomes and ethical outcomes, and that changes. One of the main aspects is, of course, safety. We are assessing 2 brand new medications with a lot of previous experience in this particular group of people. It is a challenge because we need to constantly assess the possibility of an adverse reaction to the medication. Also, the need to constantly assess the cause and effect chains. And in our case, we're doing with a double-blinded, collaborative, multi-center randomized trial, which is a huge academic effort. We sought collaboration from different international agencies that have supported us with medication and making it easier for us to deliver the medication to our people. And collaboration in times of a pandemic has challenges because moving medication from one location to another obviously has certain regulatory matters that need to be complied with. And because it is a multi-centric study involving 6 recruiting centers for this one specific protocol, clearly each center has their own differences. So we need to work with each individual center and resolve the issues that relate to each one of these centers so we can end up with designing a good protocol, ensuring quality of data, etc. So it requires a different type of management skills because we cannot hold the meetings the way we used to. Everything is done virtually. Everything has to be resolved virtually. And we need to be creative in resolving things. And one of the final aspects I would like to mention is that protocols must be designed not only taking into account the patient context, but also taking into account institutional resources available. And that's very important. For example, one of the recruiting centers may have everything to carry out the protocol, but another center may not. So how are we going to make up for that? So all of these differences between and among centers also means that we need a protocol that can account for everything. So the agencies or the institutions have to provide us with all the resources so that we can provide assistance to these COVID patients. And we need to adapt to a protocol. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not. So there's a lot of aspects that come into play. And well, of course, this includes the possibility for each institution to make staff available to follow the protocol. We don't have paid staff. It's just an academic effort at a researcher level that's involved in the protocol. So that's also a challenge.
Thank you, Jose. Ricardo, in your case, I imagine that the pandemic has magnified the challenges. You have a large study with so many centers. Could you tell us about your experience, particularly with coordination? Yes, thank you very much. In fact, I could just barely select just a few of the challenges. We could be here all week exchanging stories, but I'm just going to select some and maybe I'll look at this chronologically. The first challenge is to begin to coordinate and draft a protocol at a time when we didn't know that much about what should be entailed in a COVID vaccination protocol. So in the preparation for this study, we did not yet have this. For these large studies, and particularly to design a protocol that would meet the needs of late development of a vaccine. There are different strategies, and we even see now, we can see after the result of these first vaccines that are beginning to come out, we see that they respond to the various strategies that were used by vaccine developers. Therefore, in our context, it's about the 5th stage 3 large-scale study being done in the world. And this poses a tremendous challenge to us because we don't have a lot of references that we can look to have a way to exchange information and so forth. And one of the things that has begun to come out, and we need to assess this critically, for Brazil, this is the second study, and this generated another huge problem, which was to be expeditious enough to have such a large study in such a short period of time. So we're talking about the vaccine research centers generally recruit hundreds of participants. That's the volume of our work. And you might expect a vaccination center or vaccine center to have 1,500 participants or more at each center. And this poses many challenges in terms of logistics, recruitment of staff, training them. There are many people for whom this is the first time that they're working a clinical research trial, and you have to train them for this, and you have to have the contracts for people who are going to provide services that might go from transporting materials to obtaining the material, which can be hard to find during a context in which supply chains have been interrupted. So it's also a challenge just to get materials. And then there are a few other things that come into play. Unfortunately, they are not directly related to scientific aspects, but this is part of the context that we're living in. And we're not talking about something that's just limited to Latin America, but this includes many other countries as well. And that is that things have been they've been related to ideology, and I don't say politicization, but having vaccines within a political agenda is very valid and necessary to generate the political will so that governments and decision makers can get on board. But when this becomes part of an ideology, then it begins to generate other types of noise, background noise to the study. And we unfortunately are experiencing that. We see people who are opposed to certain figures within our national political scene, and the domestic politics here in Brazil have baselessly questioned the research protocol. The other point that gave us problems was vis-a-vis leaking confidential data, very serious problem. This happened at different levels, both in terms of documents, and even now it's more extreme and what's sadder, and that is the leaking of information related to a serious case of an adverse event. This generated a very dramatic and very painful situation in which private information was published in the national press about a case without any authorization and without any respect for confidentiality. That's a more extreme case, but there are others in which there's suspected leaks or leaks of partial documents that were misinterpreted and related to this entire process of making an ideology about this. And next, I'd like to mention that the remarks by members of the research team and the service provider companies, particularly those involved in monitoring, in which we have several investigators or researchers who have caught COVID in the course of the research. And now we still have people who are recovering. Fortunately, we didn't have any serious cases, but we did have several people get the virus, and this includes monitoring people. So 11 monitors have been diagnosed with COVID. And so there is great personal risk for those who involve in these research at the research centers, and to one degree or another. So this is part of what we're trying to control through personal protection equipment and facilitating the access to PPE, but even in a circumstance in which we have an explosive increase in the number of cases, whenever people are moving about, that increases the risk to these valuable members of the research team. So this is just to mention a few things. If you have any specific questions, I could go into more details, but this is just my first opening remarks. Thank you, Ricardo. That's all very interesting. The next question is related to reviews. All of you are from countries that have different ethical evaluation systems. In previous sessions, we've looked at these various strategies prepared by the countries for the purpose of adapting the ethical evaluations in order to expedite them. That is, what has your experience been with the ethical assessment of the studies? And we should tell the committees. Could you, would you like to start? Jose? Yes, thank you. Generally speaking, my experience has been very good within the context of the ethics committees and institutions. And how we've tried to handle different stages of the pandemic. We had to go through an exhaustive review process. And this process but until these specific situations get resolved before both committees, we've been given the okay to begin. In addition, when we have different recruitment centers, we have other specific centers, and fortunately, we have not had any problem, no major problem with this. But the modality did change significantly. Previously, the means by which we submitted a protocol, first it was done virtually, and then we could handle some of it in person. And there was a committee that was designed for this purpose. However, now everything has changed, and we try to address any situations that may arise. And all of this is done virtually through electronic submission of the documents. And this also tends to be a challenge because we continuously have to fill out material for it to be submitted. So I think that one of our lessons is the conversion of the various committees and adaptation of these committees. I think that's been very valid. Here, we have tried to give some preference to the studies that might have an impact on treatment of people who have the virus. And I think that this is an aspect that we think is very good and essential. But of course, there are other kinds of reviews that are done expeditiously for other types of protocols. I have a question, Jose. For you, is the review done by each of the committees and the participating institutions? Or did you have a more unified criteria? We put together the committee of the coordinating center, and later it was submitted to a committee in Mexico City specifically, since the recruitment centers are part of the health system of Mexico City. So we did this at these different levels. Thank you, Jose. Silvina, would you like to tell us about the experience with your federal system? Yes, it was complex, but something very good happened. The Ministry of Health put out a communique and a recommendation to the research ethics committees, and that was to have expeditious review. So we have been covered in that regard, and we receive feedback much more quickly than we have at other times. That was very good. Now, with the study that we conducted, we need to go through 4 research ethics committees, and we wanted to include other institutions, but they did not have committees. They didn't even have an ethics committee on the radar that could help them out in this kind of situation. So that was also a learning process for the institutions who hadn't even considered the possibility of working with a clinical or epidemiological research center. The other thing that happened with us was that the plasma, which is a blood component, obviously has other therapeutical uses that other than for COVID convalescent plasma. So there was a false impression that if we were going to use plasma for this, we were going to use it all the time. So this also required a big challenge in communicating that the plasma, not just since it was not approved and its effectiveness had not been proven, so we weren't 100% sure. There are complications with plasma. There are also adverse reactions with it. And you have to look at the appropriate use of plasma. So this was a good experience for the research ethics committees because we ultimately managed to convince them that you had to be sure that you were taking care of the patients. Now, in terms of our federal system, in our country, each province approves its own research. But the fact that you have a single registry of clinical trials allowed us to take the temperature of what was happening in the different provinces. Thank you, Silvina. Juan Manuel, are you back with us? I never left. Please tell us about your experience. I simply would like to mention that perhaps the obstacle that we've been able to overcome at this stage of clinical trials with the ethics committee was the goodwill of the committee to intervene in this experimental design. And this was very clear in the minds of the ethics committee, and that is that they must guarantee best clinical practices and of course compliance with ethical requirements, but experimental design is up to, or that is to say the design of the experiment is up to the researchers, and we had to submit it for approval by the ethics committee. We had to justify pharmacological and scientific aspects that perhaps were not up to be decided by the committee. And I can tell you something anecdotally. It came out very quickly, and the timing of the ethics committee is not the same time scale that researchers need. Researchers need it to always be quicker. So we need to have response from the committee in terms of timing. The other thing, in terms of the accompaniment that we got from Evina, it was really exemplary, and I'd like to point that out because we had to submit reports to Evina on a regular basis, and we did so, in fact, weekly. We sent them a report of everything that was going on in the study. One advantage that our study had was that the 3 hospitals, 2 in Bogota and 1 in Medellin, had approval of best clinical practices and the experience with clinical trials. So for us, that made life a little bit easier. Well, it wasn't easier in the usual sense of the word, but it wasn't as difficult to conduct this study because each hospital not only had a director of research, but also a clinical trials office with its own coordinator. So this was a tremendous help. We appointed a general coordinator. We had a CDF online, and we were able to have monitoring and very strict weekly monitoring until December 12th. So I think that this allowed us to overcome the challenges we faced. We did not have any serious adverse event. There were just 2 allergic responses, but other than that, we did not have any side effects related to the plasma, fortunately. Thank you, Juan Manuel. Ricardo, could you tell us about your experience in Brazil? We know that CONEP has adapted its procedures in the context of the pandemic. So the question is, how have you experienced this? Has it improved? Have the processes become shorter or quicker? First of all, allow me to say that something about the CONEP system, and this is the ethics. We have the National Ethics and Research Committee. This is a system that tries to be harmonized between the local jurisdictions and the national level, and they want to have things a bit predictable throughout the country by harmonizing the procedures. In particular, in the case of COVID-19, the National Research Ethics Committee, CONEP, determined through a circular that these should give more priority to protocols having to do with research on COVID-19 vaccine. Generally speaking, all other interventions for COVID-19. And so this was not the exception. The time that we had for evaluation of the first version of the protocol was exceptional. It was in 72 hours we achieved approval of the study, and you have to consider that questions were raised by CONEP and we had to respond to these. And of course, partially this is because, and this is part of the criticism of this EPI-CONEP system, is because CONEP doesn't ask easy questions. They generally ask quite relevant, complex questions. And the person answering or the group of people answering need to have decision-making capacity. And since this study is controlled here in Butatan, then we were able to answer all of these questions very quickly as well. And they were satisfied with our answers and gave us approval in record time. The other issue that I think should be highlighted in terms of serious adverse events, and I'd like to particularly point out CONEP's action in this particular case.
When CONEPA received information, which back then it was provisional information because we couldn't get it more, like firmer information, CONEPA took a very interesting position, which was to call the researcher in charge of the center where the case was studied and ask for clarification. I believe that attitude, like I said, was extremely interesting because it shows two things. One is that the adverse event information that we sent is not sent via pro forma. It showed that there is someone in the ethics committee that is reviewing and is providing the right treatment to each of these groups of information. The second thing that was shown is that the National Research Ethics Committee is interested in knowing what actually happened and provide guidance based on the information received from the researcher and his or her team. So we showed willingness in that regard, and they actually took the right action. Somebody asked on the chat whether there was any kind of punishment for those who filtered information. What I wanted to know is that filtering or information leaks, this did not happen within the research teams or service providers. Information leaks happens in other agencies that were somewhat related to the case, but that have nothing to do with the research ethics team. But that put us in a pretty complicated situation because these things happen in research, but they are outside of the ethics and regulatory agencies, so they are not in a position to impose sanctions. So basically, when this type of investigations or research is put in the limelight, which is in this case all over the media, certain abuses may take place. And this happened with other vaccine studies as well, where journalists take they're questioning to extremes without taking into account the people that are volunteering for the studies or their families. So it has to do more with the research environment. And like I said, and it didn't happen in Brazil only, it happened in other parts of the world as well. Thank you, Ricardo. The next question has to do with the informed consent process. In our previous session, we talked about this extensively, the ethical assessment and the need to adapt processes, the possibility of having regularly informed consent were not an option because of the hospitalization and the whole COVID pandemic context. So basically the question is, what did these processes look like for you? What kind of challenges did you find along the way? And did you have support from the ethics committee to adapt to this new reality, given the difficulty of taking into account the context in which these studies were taking place? So I don't know, Silvina, maybe since your mic is on, you can start. Well, what happened to us is that patients were moderate patients. That is to say, they were not at the ICU. So they were clear-headed and they were able to make informed decisions. In some cases, of course, they talked with their family members first. We had to adapt our technical and administrative processes because a lot of them had to be in isolation. But our patients were in a position to respond, and that was one of the criteria to include them in the research study, by the way. As far as designing the consent, we had a bioethics advisor within our Ministry of Health that helped us develop the different types of consents, because we had the donor community that were donating this experimental product, because there were challenges because they had to have the blood extracted with the apheresis process. So we had to develop, like I said, the consent for donors and then for another consent for COVID patients. We didn't have a placebo in our study, but at times we had to step in trials that used placebos because of this need and pressure from family members and doctors to actually give patients treatment. So again, the challenge had to do with information, communication, but in that sense, I believe that the researchers that use placebo have faced more difficulties because we did not have 100% effective therapeutics, and so everybody was desperate to get the real thing. Jose, do you want to add anything? Well, just like they said, they need to use different strategies from what we were used to. That is to say, the classic, come here, let's talk, I'll show you, I'll answer all the questions that you may have, etc. In this current context, at times it was very difficult to do that. So even at the study design phase, we provided for the possibility to have consent authorized electronically, especially taking into account that that was an option that the patient may accept, but without actually going to the center or hospital in order to sign the consent. So basically, we had to provide for that in the protocol design itself and develop and have the authorization sent electronically, and the same for answering questions, everything electronically. It was done with video calls or telephone calls, especially taking into account the difficulties in taking in the informed consent in person. Some people preferred to use the traditional method. In that case, we gave them an appointment and took them to a specific area designated for COVID positive people, but that are not coming for checkups. We would talk with them, answer questions, and then they signed the informed consent, voluntarily, of course. So there were some changes in that sense. And once, like I said, we included in the design the way to give consent, the committees accepted those. They understood that this was a new strategy, and that's what we've been doing, and so far, so good, I would say. Thank you, Jose. Juan Manuel, in your case, where you dealt with more serious patients, with clinical trials and placebo, what was your experience in terms of consent? Well, we did not deal with more severe patients. Our studies focused on severe patients that were hospitalized, but they were not in ICU. Just like Silvina said, all of our patients were conscious and they could consent to be a part of the study. In the 2 patients that we used the passive treatment, the idea was to have a letter signed by the family members and the treating doctor, and then we sent it to the ethics committee. But during the clinical trial, we did not have a patient that was unable to provide an informed consent with a witness. And since the purpose of our study was to assess plasma efficiency compared to traditional treatment, both arms received the traditional treatment. So we did not have any major difficulties in telling the patients that if they did not want the plasma, they would still receive the conventional treatment offered by each one of the centers, which interestingly enough ended up being the same one, because in Colombia, we follow the guidelines from the Ministry of Health and the Colombian Infectology Agency. So the majority of the patients received low molecular weight heparins and dexamethasone. Well, we knew that it was used effectively, and oxygen based on the severity and upon recommendation by the treating physician. So we had losses of patients that once they gave consent, they had to be, and this was the case in 3 or 4 patients, we were told that they wanted to withdraw from the study, and of course we respected their decision and we didn't insist or anything. But in general, we didn't face any major difficulties. Something that might be interesting to tell you is that both the consent as well as support from the ethics committee enabled us to, the samples that we used, because we took samples on day 0, 1, 7, 14, and 28, to use those samples for other experiments that had to do with defining plasma action mechanisms without calling for a new consent or having to recall the patients. There was a specific paragraph to that effect, and that honestly made it a lot easier for us to do some of the follow-up work. Thank you so much, Juan Manuel. Ricardo, in your case, the vaccine studies, like you said, were highly politicized, especially in the media, and this whole thing about misinformation. What was that consent process like, especially taking into account that you're dealing with healthy people? Yes, there were a lot of experiences, and the informed consent per se did not pose a lot of issues. There were more people willing to be part of a research but that did not qualify than any others. So somehow they wanted to find other ways to force the research center to accept them as participants. So that posed some issues. Or once in a while, I receive messages from people to that effect, and nothing can be done about that. We don't deal with participants. We don't even know what the names of the participants are. So, but anyways, the other issue that I wanted to mention, and this is an issue that all of us vaccine developers are facing, and it's, like I said, the hottest issue around consent, has to do with what happens when you do have an effective vaccine. And the issue of what happens, well, we have to see if it's the first vaccine that was part of the study, or if it's a different vaccine that proves to be effective and becomes available. So this has been one of the most frequently asked questions. And now that we are developing all the protocols around efficiency, we see the results from several developers. In our case, for example, we already kicked off the processes to do the interim analysis. So that's one of the biggest questions we have, and that is being discussed. And these discussions go from where did what you write in the protocol remain valid, or what is the position from the different organizations or regulatory agencies, the WHO itself, because there's different positions here and we may not necessarily agree with all of them. And so we need to strike a balance between the methodological aspect of, keeping people in the placebo group for as long as possible, which is very interesting, is very valuable, but at the same time, it's very upsetting for them because they're part of this research, and if this person if this person helped us develop the knowledge base, it's not fair to then leave them hanging or leave them at the end of the line. So especially because this protocol that we are developing for healthcare professionals are frontline health workers that deal with COVID patients, and therefore the risk they face is extremely high. So ethically, it's only fair to talk about placebos. I can tell you that we did not change anything. We kept the position that we had from the very beginning, in spite of all of the different questioning, and I know different international workshops discuss this with different positions on the matter by different researchers and institutions, but we, like I said, have kept our protocol. And what we found is that when faced with all these questions that were raised, we believe the most important thing is to reinforce through a letter sent to the research participants that this is what the protocol provides for, and be much more specific. So when faced with this, upcoming results, what should happen following the protocol? Because the informed consent is several pages long, and for the participant to know exactly what's included in the procedure is very difficult. That's why we thought it was more interesting to send a separate document where we explain in a lot of detail how this works. So that's what I wanted to share with you as far as informed consent goes. And one final thing, sorry, that is because our understanding is that the informed consent process does not involve a signature itself. It's an ongoing process. And that's why we want to send that letter to the participants, because we understand that as part of that ongoing process, they sometimes need additional explanation. And even though they accepted to be part of this study, now it's the time to give them a little bit more detail as to what happens. And rather than thinking that the informed consent was just one action, something that was signed and that's it, but rather help them understand that the consent is a dynamic process that is ongoing throughout the duration of the study. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. The issue of informed consent that was dealt with in previous sessions as well, we believe brought us back to the importance of this process, that it is not just an action that involves an ongoing two-way communication with, like Ricardo, you said, with the participants in clear, understandable terms. And in a way, we celebrate that an agreement was reached between the ethics committee on the importance of going back to the original value of this informed consent rather than focusing on the signature itself, which is just evidence of, willingness to participate, and that's it. But it goes a lot farther than that. Carla included in the chat room a link to the video that we had on vaccines and the issue of placebo patients, and Ricardo, I'm sure, also brought up the issue of how to continue with this beyond this session. Okay, so the next question has to do with everything that has to do with developing a research system in our countries or in our region. This is a personal question. What do you believe could be a solution to prioritize and define what kind of research needs to be carried out during a pandemic like this one? What role should the scientific community and health authorities have? And in your opinion, what mechanisms do you think we should come up with to set priorities? And what role do you have as researchers? Silvina, go ahead.
The experience in Argentina, at least with convalescent plasma, we had one very early and timely reaction. As I said, the first case in Argentina was March 19, 2020, and April 18, 2020, it issued a ministerial resolution to regulate the use of plasma throughout the country to avoid passive use in order to extend this, because what we needed to do was accumulate data to take decisions in as timely a fashion as possible. We were not just losing resources, we were losing patients. When we couldn't compile data and make it much harder to have data for decision making. So in this regard, Argentina acted quickly, and in tandem, other research teams acted to develop techniques with antibodies, with viral load, with PCR rapid tests. So there was highly disciplined progress made, but in good coordination. Now, what are the limitations we find? We find, those of us who come from epidemiological or clinical research, that we need further knowledge and training in statistical methodology. And we haven't found enough support for this. At least we've not been able to put something together to have a more immediate response that would allow us to design protocols more quickly. The other problem that I found is that we need to have an information system. And the registry of clinical trials, we did this with an email to have channels, and we worked with what we could, first with Excel, until we did something for the clinical trial. We did a CAP, which is a fundamental, accessible tool that is very user-friendly, and we should have more opportunities to train ourselves on this tool in order to converge data and have a larger data pool. The other thing is that we are not trained, informed, or educated to have access to grants. Everything that we did with the National Clinical Trial was on the researcher's own time and with some volunteers. But generally speaking, the issue of resources should be planned out in advance. If we could organize how to address this. Argentina made resources available through the Ministry of Science and Technology, but in order to have access to their private or public funding, you have to know how to submit a grant. And I think that we could be better trained in that regard. In your case, Jose, I know that your study was also academic. How do you think it's necessary, or what mechanisms could be used to prioritize research during the pandemic? In terms from the researchers and the clinicians' viewpoint, and this has been true since the beginning of the pandemic, you initially try to see that there are trials and studies that can answer questions that will enhance the ability of these patients to improve or to prevent them from having poor clinical outcomes. But I think that if we try to expedite clinical trials that might have an immediate impact on these relevant outcomes, I think that that is a point to be considered without leaving aside those that might do so naturally. But the trials that each of the speakers here have mentioned are relevant. They have practical applications and they're important for certain groups of people. These should be priorities. So that's from the researcher's vantage point. But from the clinician's vantage point, there are other viewpoints that must be considered. And that's the viewpoint of institutions or ethics committees that receive the studies and the ones they have to evaluate, how they should evaluate, which need to be expedited and which don't. And in terms of the government itself, regarding which study should undergo more intense scrutiny and which ones do not need this, I think that all of this is rather complex. But we need to draw the distinctions according to the level of relevance it may have for the people. Thank you, Jose. Juan Manuel. In Colombia, I think that an effort has been made to confront the pandemic as well as possible. I'm one of the people who would say that governments don't do what they should do, but what they can do. And in terms of what a government can do, I think Colombia has made a major effort. Simultaneously, there has been some disorder caused by good intentions, as I call it. There's been a duplication of efforts. We needed a very clear leadership to unify all this, but generally speaking, the pandemic is a public health need in which I would include epidemiology, of course. There is also a need for organizing hospital centers and care for patients, which is medical care in general. And there's another part that strikes me, is that of discovery over cross-cutting research in this area. In Colombia, I think we've needed to have a unifying thread in all of this. For example, there are 3 projects funded by the Ministry of Science to prepare the same ELISA diagnostic kit. Instead of getting these 3 groups to interact and do it just once for the entire country to use, or for all of the researchers to use, there is some disorder caused by good intentions. This not only causes redundancies and failed efforts, but it also leads to expenditures, which is not the best way to spend our money or our resources. One of the things that our countries are trying to do is to manage poverty as well as possible. We don't have the resources that some countries have, like in Europe, Asia, or the United States, to fund projects from the beginning to the end. Many of our projects are done with the participation of the researchers themselves. However, I think that on balance, if I may say this about my country, is good. We've done what we could do, and we've done even more than what we thought we could do. Thank you. Thank you, Juan Manuel. Ricardo? I think that I would second what my other colleagues have said, but right now, I'd like to add some additional information to not just repeat what they've said, and I'll focus on one aspect. In our countries, there are also places where we're trying to develop and try out various technologies, maybe vaccines, drugs, devices, diagnostic tests, etc. So I think that one area that indicates an absence of the national authorities is in terms of how, when these interactions are taking place, the researchers are left alone. There isn't any way to ensure that the results of the research, which may be very interesting when the country participates, could be transferred in practice to benefit the entire population. That does not yet occur explicitly, and I will just mention, and this is what I'm more familiar with, are the vaccine studies. And we have 4 vaccine studies underway here. And when they get approved, well, it was only our study from Butatan, in which from the outset, we were ensuring that the entire population would have access through technology transfer and through a distribution agreement. Subsequently, after approval of the study, we got an agreement with Oxford AstraZeneca, but that came subsequently. In the beginning, the researchers are alone without the support of the government, and thus far, we are not aware of any prior negotiations or anything else related to Pfizer or Janssen that are the other companies doing research here. Thus far, it is just now that they're beginning to have discussions with the health authorities. And I'm just giving you an example, and that's the example of vaccines, and that's a highly relevant one. But it would seem that researchers are still alone. They have to negotiate this all on their own, and they're at a great disadvantage because they face a company that has a lot of resources and can decide whether what we're talking about, we're competing for scarce resources, and how are these going to be distributed if there's a favorable outcome or favorable result? And this is a country that helped create this knowledge. Are we going to be at the beginning of the line or the end of the line? At the end of the day, that's highly relevant. And I say this because many of the technology developed here outside of a pandemic context, that's what happens. And I'm just saying that our region helps companies build and learn knowledge. We literally give them our blood and our cells to generate knowledge. But when the time comes to distribute the benefits, they don't take us into consideration. So this requires a national government that can participate, can be an interlocutor to ensure that our population will benefit from the knowledge that is created, because it needs to be made available to the society that helped do it. In the case of the pandemic, it is extreme, and we'll see. Unfortunately, we're watching this. We'll continue to watch it. We see that some countries have achieved major success in obtaining the number of dosages of candidate vaccines for part of the population, whereas other countries, despite the fact that they are actively participating in the studies, are thinking of how this could be possible because they don't receive any support or have any guidelines in terms of national policy, and that wind up being left up to the independent researchers. So this becomes very obvious in the context of a pandemic. The researchers should not be left to negotiate this on their own. The national government needs to be there providing support and ensuring that the perspective of letting this benefit society is included. Thank you, Ricardo. And one last question. You've spoken about the need for registries to know what is being researched. Juan Manuel talked about the duplication of efforts, which we've seen throughout the region. There are some studies with small samples. Ricardo was also talking about this. That's a feeling and that's a reality. It seems like the researchers are isolated. They're working independently. There is no coordination and no systemic approach. And so my question is, what do you suggest? What possibilities do you see in terms of initiating collaborative initiatives in the region, not just within the country, but within the region? So perhaps this is something that scientific societies could tackle. Silvina, I insist on information systems. We need to share information, make it very transparent. We all need to know what groups are being investigated, which patients, what is the final product. We also have the question, since the demand for plasma was so great and there are physicians who were criminally prosecuted for this, many centers began to conduct clinical trials to apply this. The design doesn't start with a question, but rather the need to apply a given treatment. So there were many centers that did a lot of small studies with very similar patients and the same endpoint. Since they did not have a structure to continue, then those studies will never be published, when they could have been part of a larger study if they were designed properly. So I think that if you need to start somewhere, then you have to have a national or regional system with highly trained researchers so that they can bring up their work. There's a little bit of ego involved in all of this, as we know. It was a race to be the first one, to have the first treatment, and to go beyond a certain intervention that's good for public health. So sometimes we have to think that when we invite people to be part of something larger, then they wouldn't be the one who wins the race. We also have to keep training ourselves a lot. Clinical and epidemiological thought has a long way to go. And to this end, we need to educate people. We need to take opportunities to review and to learn. Thank you, Silvina. We'll now go on to Juan Manuel, who has to leave. Well, I have to leave by thanking you. This kind of meeting could be the first step towards finding a way to unify the approach throughout Latin America. I have agreed with everyone's opinions here, and I'd like to highlight what Ricardo said, which I found imbued with a high level of humanism, and I thank you very much, Ricardo. As you said, consent is much more than a signature. It's a continuous process. I agree with you 100%. Aside from the disorder caused by good intentions, I think that the regulatory agencies and ministries are also responsible for this disorder. And a ministry such as science, our Ministry of Science, in which it is approving similar projects for different groups, and they have not tried to use their good authority and sit people down to discuss this and try to reach a consensus despite individual egos. That is part of the responsibility that they have in this regard. I believe, and I don't want to go on at length, but I believe that the kind of meeting that you have organized here today should be held on a regular basis, whether or not there is a pandemic, because one of the objectives we should all have in mind is that this time we really should learn the lessons that nature is teaching us. Often we don't learn the lessons that we should have learned. For example, I'm talking about when we had chikungunya or Zika, in which major efforts were deployed, but we didn't learn the big lessons, at least to know how to respond much better to the pandemic. So I am very grateful, and I think that part of the solution or part of the answer to your question, Anna, is that these kinds of meetings should be held periodically to ensure that there's greater communication amongst researchers in Latin America, not only for clinical trials, but for many, many other things. And ultimately, and I say this very respectfully, this should be done regardless of any political interests or other distractions that might take our attention away from what's really important. So thank you very much. And I want to express my appreciation and gratitude for this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Juan Manuel. It was a pleasure to have you with us. The pleasure's mine. Thank you. Ricardo or Jose, would you like to add anything just to wrap up and then move on to the Q&A session? Well, I believe that cooperation is essential. In this sense, for example, in studies, we are cooperating with international agencies because what we were suggesting was something that they were interested in reviewing, and they couldn't do it because the number of cases that they had at the time was not large enough for research purposes. So this is like an experience that shows us that I'm sure there's someone's needs that can be supplemented by what others can do. But in order to do that, we need to be able to communicate with each other so that we know what we have, what we are missing, what's being done, what's not being done, etc. To give you an example, our research, more likely than not at the end, will be collated with another study that is taking place at a different location for the purposes of knowing whether, if by crunching the numbers we can better interpret the results. But that won't be possible if we don't know what the other people are doing or other agencies are doing. Oftentimes, as a researcher, you do your own thing without necessarily knowing what everybody else is doing. A registry is a very good opportunity, and this possibility to share information and know what's being done is key. and also to know how the different research studies are playing out. Thank you, Jose. Ricardo? Yes, I believe there's been several interesting international experiences. And once again, I'm going to mention some things that were done that basically have to do with information sharing, like Silvina said, because that is absolutely key. As part of initiatives, there were several international workshops organized by different agencies such as WHO, COVAX, the Organization Work Speed in the United States, and other international efforts to share information. And I believe that these efforts could also take place at the regional level to hold these workshops where we can work in different areas, like Silvina and Juan Manuel pointed out. We can find several common initiatives and we can learn from each other and even have multinational clinical trials to have each agency do a portion of the study and therefore have a quicker results. So all of this is very interesting. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that there was a transparency initiative that was unprecedented, I must say, where people started showing their research protocols while they were staying in their research process. Often a research protocol is revealed once you publish the results, but there's been several initiatives like by Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, etc., have revealed or disclosed their research protocols, and that can help other groups because they can compare, contrast, learn, and then based on that, coming up with a better way of doing their research studies. Another thing that could be done, and maybe it will be up to PAHO to do it, would be to identify the centers or locations where, based on that experience, they are able to achieve excellence or leadership position, and to start working with those centers in order to strengthen them as nodes for regional cooperation. So just like we have networks, for example, the influenza surveillance network, which enabled us to detect this COVID pandemic, because that was the basis for all the countries to be able to assess the magnitude of this COVID pandemic. So to, again, have a clinical research excellence network where we could we could go from having a subordinate role in the region where we simply implement research outcomes and become valid interlocutors that can speak with our counterparts in other countries at the same level, which is what we have tried to do, by the way, with Sinovac in China, where there is cooperation between peers with no subordination. And that is something that if we work as part of a network involving different groups, we can strengthen these capabilities, look for synergies, and start working as peers with other regions in the world. And this may enable us to respond more quickly. Latin America was hit very hard. We had the alert where the N1H1 warning came out, the same for Zika, and it is a highly vulnerable region, especially in terms of infectious diseases. So maybe we can prepare ourselves to be in a better position, to have a more exhaustive type of preparation and have these networks ready so we can lead processes when the next pandemic comes up, because it's no longer a matter of if we're going to have one, but rather when our next pandemic is going to hit us. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. very interesting. Unfortunately, we're running short on time for questions, but honestly, we could listen to you all day. So, Sarah, should we move on to the questions? Yes. Thank you so much for your presentations. I believe that you shed a lot of light on all the questions that we have received from the audience. And actually, a lot of the questions from our participants have already been answered because they were along the same lines of what you prepared as part of your presentation. And also because researchers have been paying close attention to the chat and trying to respond beforehand, before we get to this Q&A session. We have a few minutes, so unfortunately we won't be able to read out all the questions that we would have liked to read out, but we'll begin with one that has to do with community in general. There's a lot of expectation around COVID research studies and their results. So what mechanisms have been designed and implemented to engage the population in in research that you carry out during the pandemic? Ricardo? Well, this has been a major communication challenge. What we try to do, maybe because we're a government agency, which is the Butantan Institute, we're part of the state of Sao Paulo government, what we tried to do was to be as transparent as possible. We have used different mechanisms such as websites and bulletins and interviews where we had spokespeople from our institute answer questions and give information. And we also compiled different videos to post on social media such as YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, where we try to address the community directly, which has been a challenge, by the way, because there's a lot of restrictions for people, to be out and about. This is one of the mechanisms. The other mechanism that we use and promoted in the area of vaccines is that we started a series of conferences in our country, and luckily our original idea was supported by many other agencies, and the idea was to organize conferences for lay audience that has no specialized knowledge, and also for specialists, where we invite people representing different vaccine research studies. This is specifically for vaccines. So from the very beginning, we try to invite different representatives from vaccine groups, and that idea was supported by a lot of groups, so we were able to give out these conferences, like I said, for different audiences. And this enabled us to disseminate knowledge as to how this works, because obviously this creates a lot of anxiety in our population. This is part of what we have done. We have learned a lot along the way, and I believe it's important, and this is just to conclude, we had to start monitoring fake news. There's a lot of fake news out there, and so we had to monitor those. We had to ask for specialized help for that, and we started with our official communications channels, like I said, the social media, etc., to try to address concerns directly. And also we had news fact checkers. Brazil has like 3 or 4 major news fact checkers, and we had to resort to them as well. But these are phenomena that we were not used to dealing with, and now we're facing. There's a different reality. The information is disseminated differently, and we need to adapt to this new reality. Thank you. I wanted to say that we held several regional meetings with PAHO through the transfusion medicine group, we were able to gather representatives from all countries in the region. Carla Sainz was present in several of them, and they were very enlightening, because there were meetings like this where we only talked about convalescent plasma and what was happening in the region. Another issue that came up as part of this pandemic is that we organized a basic research training course for 15 professionals in the regional. It will begin this Wednesday. It would last for 6 months, and everything was inspired on what we were identifying as weaknesses. At least in the blood bank clinic, there were a lot of weaknesses in terms of human resource training and methodology and critical reading of scientific studies, because in order to develop a new protocol, you need to have read a lot. And we saw that maybe this goes back to what Ricardo was saying. There's a weakness in interpreting scientific work in order to make better decisions. So that was our starting point. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I say something? Yes. I would say that it's also important to engage the population. It's a huge challenge, especially in this pandemic context where there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, to try to explain the context, of a clinical study as part of this, pandemic phenomenon. It's very complicated, because we have to explain how important it is to research new treatment and new medicines that may or may not benefit them who are suffering, the disease. So to an extent, you have to become an expert in managing these situations without having had some previous training in that. Because again, this is not something that we are trained to do, to face these situations, especially as in the middle of a pandemic. So this is something that we had to learn on the go. But I believe that a very important aspect to highlight is the need to be transparent in everything. The possibility of getting some kind of benefit, the inherent risk, and being transparent. Also being transparent as far as the results of the study and information. I believe that that has to be stressed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all that experience. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We had a few more questions, but we will save them because this is not the end of our sessions, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Carla, the floor is yours to wrap up today's session. And once again, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you so much, Silvina, Jose, Ricardo, and Juan Manuel, who unfortunately had to leave earlier. I believe this has been an excellent session. That leaves us with a laundry list of things to do. And I must acknowledge that in a lot of cases, we know that we have to do X, but we don't know how to do it. And so maybe the main thing that we need to figure out is, how do we ensure that cooperation? Like you said, it begins with a dialogue, with sharing, but not necessarily a dialogue and sharing leads to cooperation and, collating a lot of small studies into a larger one, etc. So I believe that we need to have some kind of suggestion box to prepare for our next health emergency. That I agree, Ricardo, it's not a matter of if, but rather a matter of when. And we also must acknowledge that we have done some things better than with Zika, and definitely better than for H1N1 and SARS as well. it hit some countries in the region harder than others. But anyways, I believe that the issue of cooperation in order to ensure a bigger impact and all of these cooperating efforts in terms of research in the region is extremely important, and it has a lot of different facets. You know, we have the issue of transparency, like Silvina mentioned. In order to cooperate, you need to know who else is sitting at the table, right? So basically, there's a series of elements that I believe we need to start working on now. And finally, another substantive issue is the moral obligation that we all have in ensuring that the research that we do and that we're involved in and that comes out of our region can ultimately result in benefits for the health and well-being of our population. And in that sense, it's not just a matter of blaming one side or the other, but rather it's like a meeting of the minds to ensure cooperation and to do a summation of efforts that includes, you know, authorities, researchers, and everyone in between. We have, like I said, a laundry list of things to do. And once again, thank you so much for joining us in this session. And as you know, this is one of a series, and the 5th session that we have scheduled will be in a week from today on December 1st. And once again, we will have members from the ethics committee to reflect on a fundamental aspect of the ongoing supervision of our research protocols, which is the balance or assessment of all the risk and benefits that stem from the study, which, like you said, is changing constantly. It's not static. So would like to invite you to our next session. We will be sending you again the invitation through our ethics investigation link. And thank you once again very much, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.